Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I always thought Christmas was supposed to be about family, laughter, and togetherness. The smell of cinnamon in the air, the sound of carols playing in the background, and the joy of being surrounded by loved ones. But last year, Christmas became the worst night of my life. I was sitting in the living room of the house I grew up in, sipping hot cocoa and watching the Christmas tree lights blink softly. The house felt so familiar, so full of memories of my mom decorating the tree with me when I was a kid. My dad had remarried a few years ago, but I'd still always thought of this house as mine, as ours. That's when Ryan stormed in, slamming the front door behind him. He looked at me like I didn't belong there, his face set in a smug, self-satisfied expression. "You need to pack your stuff," he said bluntly, without even saying hello. I laughed, thinking it had to be some kind of joke. "What are you talking about?" I asked, still holding my cocoa, confused and slightly amused by his tone. "I own this house now," he said, crossing his arms over his chest like he was laying down the law. "And I don't want you here." I stared at him, trying to process what he just said. "Excuse me?" I replied, my voice incredulous. "You own the house?" Ryan walked over to the coffee table, pulled a folder out of his bag, and slammed it down in front of me. "It's all legal," he said with a grin that made my blood boil. He flipped open the folder, and my heart sank when I saw it. There were papers with my dad's signature at the bottom, and the words "bill of sale" stared back at me like a slap in the face. I could barely breathe. "No, this has to be some kind of mistake," I stammered. "It's not a mistake," Ryan said, clearly enjoying my reaction. "Dad sold me the house months ago. You should have known by now." I could feel my hands start to shake. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone and dialed my dad. The phone rang twice before he picked up. "Dad," I said, my voice trembling, "why is Ryan saying he owns the house now?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, like he was scrambling for an explanation. "Oh, yeah," he said finally, his voice calm, too calm. "I meant to tell you about that." "You meant to tell me?" I snapped, standing up from the couch. "You sold the house? Without even talking to me?" "It's complicated," he said, like that was supposed to make me feel better. My mind was racing, but I couldn't focus on anything except the fact that this was the house my mom had left to us before she passed away. She'd always called it our little piece of stability. It was the place I'd spent my entire childhood, and now I was being kicked out of it on Christmas Eve. "Why would you do this?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "Mom's house? Our house." "It's not that simple," my dad said, still maddeningly calm. "Ryan needed a place and, well, he's family now too." "Family?" I spat. "I'm your family." But my dad didn't seem to understand. Or maybe he just didn't care. The conversation ended with him saying, "We'll talk about it later," and hanging up. I stared at the phone in disbelief, tears threatening to spill over. Ryan was still standing there, arms crossed, smirking like he'd just won some kind of twisted game. "You heard him," he said. "So, when are you leaving?" I didn't have an answer for him. All I knew was that everything I thought I could count on, my dad, my home, even the memories of my mom, felt like they'd been ripped away from me in the blink of an eye. And Ryan? He just stood there, grinning. "Merry Christmas, right?" That Christmas Eve, I packed a bag, walked out of the house, and drove aimlessly for hours. My stepbrother's smug grin and those papers with my dad's signature were burned into my mind. I couldn't stop replaying everything in my head. How could my dad sell our family home, the house that my mom had left us, without even mentioning it to me? It felt like a betrayal on every level. This wasn't just a house, it was our house. My mom had called it her forever home. It was where we'd had every birthday party, every Christmas, and every lazy Sunday morning. And now, because of some deal my dad made behind my back, I'd been kicked out of it like I was a stranger. That night, I stayed at a cheap motel. The tiny room smelled like bleach and regret, and I barely slept, my mind racing with anger and confusion. By morning, I knew I needed answers. So I got in my car and drove to my dad's new place. He was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone like it was just another ordinary day. His wife, Laura, was sitting across from him, flipping through a magazine. The sight of them looking so calm, so casual, made my blood boil. "Why didn't you tell me you sold the house?" I demanded, my voice sharp. My dad glanced up at me, his face annoyingly blank. "Good morning to you, too," he said, setting down his coffee cup. I wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. "Why didn't you tell Me, I repeated, emphasizing every word. He sighed, like this whole thing was some minor inconvenience for him. Ryan needed a place, he said with a shrug, as if that explained everything. And I thought it would be good for the family. Good for the family? I snapped, my voice rising. Dad, you sold our home. Mom's home. And you didn't even tell me. Laura jumped in then, her tone sickeningly sweet. We didn't think it would be a big deal, she said, folding her hands like she was delivering some kind of sermon. Ryan was struggling, and we all thought it was the best solution. I stared at her, dumbfounded. You thought kicking me out of my own house on Christmas Eve wasn't a big deal? Laura gave me that patronizing smile she always used when she wanted to make me feel small. No one's kicking you out, she said. You could have stayed, you know, as long as you respected Ryan's ownership. His ownership? I laughed bitterly. The only reason Ryan owns that house is because you two handed it to him on a silver platter. That's when I started connecting the dots. Something about the whole situation felt off, and I wasn't just talking about the timing. My dad hadn't just sold the house to Ryan. He'd sold it for way less than it was worth. Why did you sell it for so little? I asked, narrowing my eyes at my dad. He hesitated for a moment, glancing at Laura like he was trying to decide whether to tell me the truth. Finally, he sighed and said, Ryan needed help. He's been working on this business venture. Business venture? I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. Laura chimed in again, her tone defensive this time. Ryan has been working really hard to get his business off the ground. We wanted to support him. I stared at them, feeling like the ground had been pulled out from under me. So let me get this straight, I said slowly. You sold Mom's house for less than it was worth so Ryan could use the money for some business scheme? My dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but didn't deny it. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about the house. My dad wasn't thinking about me, or our family's legacy, or what my mom would have wanted. He'd chosen his new wife and her son over me, his own daughter. And the worst part? He didn't even seem to feel bad about it. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping against the floor with an angry screech. You know what, Dad? Don't bother explaining. It's obvious where your priorities are. Don't do this, he said, but his tone was more tired than remorseful. We're still family. No, we're not. I shot back, grabbing my bag and heading for the door. Because family doesn't do this to each other. I left without another word, slamming the door behind me. As I drove away, tears blurred my vision, but my anger burned hotter than my sadness. I wasn't just mad at my dad. I was mad at myself for believing that he'd always have my back. By the time I got back to the motel, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to let this slide. I didn't know how yet, but I was going to find out the full truth about why my dad sold the house. And I was going to make sure Ryan and Laura didn't get away with it. They'd taken everything from me. Now it was my turn to fight back. After leaving my dad's house, I couldn't stop replaying our conversation in my head. Every time I thought about his excuses, how Ryan needed the house or how it was good for the family, I got angrier. None of it made sense. What kind of business venture was so important that it justified selling the home my mom had worked so hard to create? I knew there was more to the story, and if my dad wasn't going to be honest with me, I'd have to figure it out myself. That night, I opened my laptop and started digging. I didn't have much to go on at first, but I started with what I knew, Ryan's name and his supposed business venture. The deeper I went, the more unsettling the pieces became. Ryan's business venture wasn't some innovative startup or a smart investment opportunity. It was a complete disaster. I found traces of his financial mess through old social media posts, news articles, and even public records. It turned out Ryan had been involved in several failed businesses over the past few years, each one worse than the last. One was a pyramid scheme that had collapsed, leaving him on the hook for thousands. Another was a failed bar he'd opened with friends, which had gone under in less than 6 months because of unpaid bills and health code violations. But the worst part? Ryan wasn't just bad with business, he was bad with money in general. I uncovered a trail of gambling debts that had spiraled out of control. He'd borrowed money from shady lenders, maxed out credit cards, and even taken out payday loans to try and cover his losses. By the time I pieced everything together, it was clear. Ryan wasn't an ambitious entrepreneur. He was a financial wreck. I wasn't done yet, though. Something told me my dad had been involved in this for longer than I realized. So I started digging through old emails and text messages. My dad wasn't great with technology, and he'd often leave his accounts logged in on the family computer. So I still had access to some of his correspondence. What I found made my stomach turn. There were emails from Ryan going back years, asking my dad for money. At first, it seemed harmless enough. Small amounts here and there to help with bills or cover a shortfall, but as time went on, the amounts got bigger. One email stood out. Dad, I hate to ask again, but I need $20,000 by the end of the month. If I don't pay these guys back, I'm in serious trouble. Please don't tell Laura. I don't want her to worry. I felt sick as I read through the messages. It was clear that Ryan had been leaning on my dad for years, using guilt and desperation to squeeze money out of him. And my dad, whether out of fear, loyalty, or just plain naivety, had kept bailing him out. Selling the house wasn't about helping the family or a good investment. It was about Ryan's endless string of bad decisions. My dad had sold the home my mom had left us because Ryan had gotten himself into trouble again, and my dad couldn't say no. The next day, I went back to confront him. He was sitting in the same spot at the kitchen table, this time with a newspaper in hand. When he saw me walk in, he looked up with an exasperated sigh. "Let me guess," he said. "You're still mad about the house." "You're damn right I'm still mad," I snapped. "But this isn't about the house anymore. It's about Ryan." He froze, the newspaper halfway to the table. "What about Ryan?" "I know about the money," I said, throwing a stack of printed emails onto the table. "I know about the loans, the gambling, the businesses. I know you've been bailing him out for years." His face paled as he stared at the emails. For a moment, he didn't say anything, and I wondered if he was going to deny it. But then he sighed heavily and rubbed his temples. "Ryan's had a tough time," he said, as if that excused everything. "Tough time," I repeated, my voice rising. "And what about me, Dad? What about Mom? You sold her house, our house, just so Ryan could keep digging himself deeper into trouble. Do I not matter to you at all?" "Of course you matter," he said, his voice defensive. "But he's family too. He needed my help, and I don't." I shot back. "Do you have any idea how much it hurt to find out that you'd sold the house without even telling me? To have Ryan throw me out like I was a stranger?" He didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at the table like he couldn't look me in the eye. It was in that moment I realized the truth. My dad wasn't going to change. He'd made his choice, and it wasn't me. His loyalty was with Laura and Ryan now, no matter how much it hurt me or dishonored my mom's memory. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You know what, Dad? Keep helping Ryan. Keep cleaning up his messes. But don't expect me to stick around and watch you throw away everything Mom built." I walked out of the house without looking back, tears streaming down my face. That was the day I realized I couldn't trust him anymore. My dad had chosen his new family over me, and no matter how much I tried to reason with him, it was clear that nothing I said would change his mind. But I wasn't going to let this go. Ryan and Laura might have taken my home, but I wasn't going to let them take my dignity. It was time to fight back. Just when I thought I was completely alone, abandoned by my dad, thrown out of my home by Ryan, and unsure of what to do next, I got a call that changed everything. It was late at night, and I was sitting on the bed in my dingy motel room, scrolling through old photos on my phone, trying to hold on to any piece of comfort I could find. That's when my phone lit up with an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer it, but something told me to pick up. "Hello?" I said hesitantly. "Sweetheart, it's Aunt Beth," a warm voice replied on the other end of the line. "I just heard what happened. Are you okay?" Hearing her voice was like a lifeline. My mom's sister, Beth, had always been the fun, quirky aunt who swooped into town for holidays, bringing laughter and the best presents. After my mom passed away, though, she and my dad had drifted apart, and we hadn't spoken in years. But now, here she was, reaching out to me when I needed someone the most. I tried to hold it together as I told her everything. How my dad had sold the house without telling me, how Ryan had kicked me out on Christmas Eve, and how betrayed I felt. But by the time I got to the part about my dad shrugging it all off like it was no big deal, the tears started flowing. "That house was your mom's pride and joy," Aunt Beth said, her voice tight with emotion. "She poured her heart into that place. I can't believe your dad would do something like this. I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice trembling. "It feels like I've lost everything. Mom, the house, even Dad." Aunt Beth didn't hesitate. "Pack your things and come stay with me," she said firmly. "You don't have to go through this alone. Your mom made me promise to look after you if anything ever happened, and I think it's time I kept that promise." I don't think I'd ever felt more relieved in my life. The next morning, I packed up my motel room and drove to Aunt Beth's house. She lived about 2 hours away in a quiet little neighborhood that felt like the opposite of the chaos I'd just left behind. When I pulled into her driveway, she was already waiting on the porch, arms open wide. She hugged me like she hadn't seen me in years, which, to be fair, was true, and led me inside. Her house smelled like fresh-baked cookies and lavender, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. Over coffee at her kitchen table, I told her everything in more detail. She listened intently, her expression growing darker with every word. "Your mom wouldn't have stood for this," she said finally, her voice laced with anger. "That house wasn't just a home. It was part of her legacy. She made sure of it." "What do you mean?" I asked, frowning. Aunt Beth hesitated for a moment, then said, "Did you know your mom left specific instructions in her will about the house?" I froze. "No, I didn't know that. She told me about it before she passed," Beth said, leaning forward. "The house was supposed to stay in the family. She was adamant about that. Your dad could live there, you could live there, but it wasn't supposed to be sold. Not ever." Hearing that felt like a punch to the gut. "But Dad ignored her wishes," I said quietly. "He sold it to Ryan like it didn't even matter." Aunt Beth nodded grimly. "I think your dad's forgotten who he's supposed to be loyal to. But if your mom put it in her will, that means we might have a case. We could fight this." Her words sent a spark of hope through me. Could we really fight it? Could I actually get the house back? Aunt Beth didn't waste any time. She started digging through old documents, making calls, and even set me up with a lawyer she trusted. "We're going to get to the bottom of this," she promised. "Your mom fought for that house, and now we'll fight for it too." It wasn't the ideal solution. I still felt like a huge part of my life had been ripped away, and I wasn't sure I could ever forgive my dad for what he'd done. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had someone in my corner, someone who truly cared about me and what my mom had wanted. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about standing up for my mom's memory and everything she'd worked so hard to protect. And with Aunt Beth by my side, I felt like I could finally do it. When Aunt Beth heard about my mom's will and how the house was supposed to stay in the family, she didn't waste a second. "This isn't over," she said, her eyes blazing with determination. "Your mom wouldn't want you to back down, and neither do I." She pulled out a dusty folder from her home office, the one where she kept all of the old paperwork my mom had shared with her over the years. Inside was a copy of the original will. It was like my mom's voice coming through, loud and clear. The house was to remain in the family, and no major decisions regarding it could be made without consulting me first. We took the paperwork to the lawyer Aunt Beth had already contacted. Her name was Janet, a no-nonsense attorney with a reputation for being sharp and thorough. Janet pored over the documents and raised an eyebrow. "Your dad didn't have the right to sell this house," she said, tapping her pen on the will. "If these terms still hold, and it seems like they do, this sale can be contested." Hearing that was like a weight being lifted off my chest. For weeks, I'd felt powerless, like my dad and Ryan had taken everything from me without a second thought. Now, for the first time, I felt like I had a fighting chance. Janet filed the necessary paperwork to contest the sale, which essentially froze any further transactions involving the house. Ryan wouldn't be able to sell it, remodel it, or do much of anything until the case was resolved. From what Janet said, he hadn't even fully paid my dad yet. He was likely waiting to flip the house or use it as collateral for another one of his ridiculous business ventures. To say my dad was furious when he found out about the lawsuit would be an understatement. He called me the day after he got served, his voice already raised before I even said hello. "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" he shouted. "You're tearing this family apart." "No, Dad," I shot back, my voice steady. "You tore this family apart when you sold the house behind my back." He didn't stop there. He launched into a tirade about how I was being selfish and how Ryan was trying to build a future for himself. "Do you really want to ruin Ryan's life?" he demanded. "Ryan ruined his own life," I said coldly. "He gambled away his money, made bad investments, and dragged you into his mess. Don't try to blame me for cleaning up after him. You don't understand the pressure I've been under," he replied, his tone shifting from anger to guilt-tripping. "Ryan needed me, and I didn't." I snapped. "Did you even think about me, Dad? Did you think about what Mom would have wanted? Or was Ryan's business venture more important than the home she built for us?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When my dad finally spoke, his voice was quieter but no less frustrating. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said. "For the family." I hung up without responding. If he couldn't see how wrong he'd been, I wasn't going to waste my breath trying to convince him. The weeks that followed were a blur of paperwork, meetings with Janet, and updates on the case. Ryan, of course, wasn't taking any of this well. I got a series of nasty text messages from him, ranging from insults to thinly veiled threats. One read, "You're pathetic. You're not going to win. so just drop this before you embarrass yourself even more. I didn't respond. Let him think whatever he wanted. I wasn't doing this for him, or for my dad, or even for myself. I was doing it for my mom. The legal process was messy. Ryan's lawyer tried to argue that the will didn't apply anymore, given that the house had been in my dad's name since my mom passed away. But Janet countered with the fact that the will explicitly stated my involvement in any major decisions regarding the house, regardless of who technically held the title. Ryan's lawyer also tried to paint me as a bitter, spiteful daughter who was trying to sabotage my dad's new family. Janet shut that down, too, pointing out the clear pattern of financial mismanagement on Ryan's part and the shady nature of the sale. Every hearing, every document, and every argument just reinforced how wrong the sale had been. By the time we reached the final stages of the case, it was clear that Ryan's ownership of the house wasn't as airtight as he thought. One evening, as Aunt Beth and I sat in her living room reviewing the latest updates from Janet, she gave me a proud smile. "You're doing the right thing," she said. "Your mom would be so proud of you." Hearing that brought tears to my eyes. This wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about standing up for what was right and making sure my mom's wishes were honored. The final court hearing was nerve-wracking. My dad and Ryan were both there, sitting across the room from me and Aunt Beth. I could feel their glares burning into me, but I refused to look at them. When the judge ruled in my favor, voiding the sale and reinstating my rights to the house, it was like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. After the hearing, my dad tried to approach me, but I walked away before he could say anything. I didn't want to hear more excuses or guilt trips. Ryan, on the other hand, was fuming. "You're going to regret this," he hissed as I walked past him. But I knew he was all bark and no bite. He'd lost, and there was nothing he could do about it. The house was mine again, but the victory felt bittersweet. My relationship with my dad was in shambles, and I knew it might never be repaired. But at least I'd done what my mom would have wanted. I was finally standing on solid ground again, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. The weeks leading up to the court hearing were some of the most stressful I'd ever experienced. Every day felt like a battle, even before we stepped into the courtroom. My dad seemed determined to make me feel like I was the villain, not him. He bombarded me with guilt-tripping texts, all centering around family loyalty. "Why are you doing this? You're tearing the family apart." One text read, "This is Ryan's chance to get back on his feet. He needs this more than you do," said another. Laura wasn't much better. She left me a long voicemail one night, crying about how I was being cruel to Ryan and selfish for pursuing the case. It took everything in me not to scream at the phone when she said, "This isn't what your mom would have wanted." But what really got under my skin was Ryan. He hadn't said a word to me since kicking me out on Christmas Eve, but 2 weeks before the hearing, I got a text from him. "You're pathetic. You're not going to win. So stop embarrassing yourself." I didn't reply to any of them. Instead, I focused on preparing for the case with my lawyer, Janet, and leaning on Aunt Beth for support. The night before the hearing, Aunt Beth sat with me at her kitchen table as I went over everything one last time. She could tell I was nervous. "You've got this," she said, placing a hand on mine. "You're not just fighting for the house, you're fighting for your mom's memory. No matter what happens tomorrow, she'd be so proud of you." Her words gave me the strength I needed. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. When the court date finally arrived, I was a bundle of nerves. The courthouse felt cold and intimidating, and the sight of my dad, Laura, and Ryan sitting together on one side of the room only made it worse. Seeing my dad glare at me like I was some kind of enemy broke my heart, but I forced myself to stay focused. Aunt Beth was right beside me, and Janet was ready to fight. The case itself was fairly straightforward, but the tension in the room was palpable. Janet started by presenting the terms of my mom's will, laying out in detail how it explicitly stated that the house was to remain in the family and that any major decisions required my input. Ryan's lawyer tried to argue that my dad was the sole owner of the house after my mom passed, which gave him the right to sell it. But Janet countered with the will, emphasizing how it legally obligated my dad to consult me before making any decisions about the property. The judge didn't seem impressed when Ryan's lawyer claimed the sale was made in good faith. Janet tore that argument apart. "Good faith," she said, her tone sharp. "The defendant sold the home to his stepson for significantly less than market value, without consulting the rightful heir, in direct violation of the deceased's wishes. This wasn't good faith. It was a betrayal." When my dad took the stand, I could barely look at him. He tried to defend his actions, claiming that he sold the house because he thought it was best for everyone and that Ryan needed a place to live. But then the judge asked him the one question that hung over the entire case. If you believe this was best for everyone, why didn't you inform your daughter or involve her in the decision? My dad froze. He stammered for a few moments, searching for an answer, but he had nothing. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Ryan didn't even try to speak in his defense. He just sat there, staring at his shoes, clearly uncomfortable. The truth was out, and there was no way to spin it in their favor. By the time the hearing ended, it was clear which way the judge was leaning. A few days later, Janet called me with the news. The sale was voided, and ownership of the house was restored to me. The moment she said those words, I felt a wave of relief so overwhelming I nearly cried. After everything I'd been through, the betrayal, the anger, the heartbreak, I'd finally gotten justice. But that relief was quickly replaced by anger. My dad had put me through hell for months, all because he couldn't prioritize his family's legacy over Ryan's selfish needs. He'd sold out my mom's memory, my childhood home, and me, all to bail out someone who didn't deserve it. That evening, Aunt Beth and I sat together in her living room, quietly celebrating the victory. She hugged me tightly and said, "You did it. Your mom would be so proud of you." But as much as I wanted to feel happy, there was a lingering sadness I couldn't shake. Winning the case hadn't fixed the damage my dad had done to our relationship, and I wasn't sure if it ever could. Still, one thing was certain. The house was back where it belonged. And no one, not Ryan, not Laura, and not even my dad, could take it away from me again. The fallout from the court ruling was even worse than I'd imagined. Ryan, who had been so smug and condescending when he kicked me out on Christmas Eve, completely lost it. His self-assured, cocky demeanor vanished the moment the judge voided the sale. Now, he was just a furious, entitled mess. I stopped by the house to check on things a few days after the ruling. Aunt Beth had insisted on coming with me, just in case, and I was glad she did because Ryan was already there when we arrived. He must have been packing up his things, but the sight of me walking in sent him into a tailspin. "This is so unfair," he yelled, throwing his hands up dramatically. His voice echoed in the nearly empty living room. "Do you even know how much money I've put into this place? I've been working on this house for months." "Money you shouldn't have spent," I said calmly, not taking the bait. "The house was never yours to begin with." That only made him angrier. His face turned bright red, and he glared at me like I was the cause of every problem in his life. "You're just bitter," he spat. "You can't stand the fact that Dad actually cares about me and not you." His words stung more than I wanted to admit, but I didn't let it show. I stood my ground, my voice steady as I replied, "That's funny. Because if he cared about you so much, why didn't he bother to tell you the sale was illegal? Or that the house wasn't even his to sell?" Ryan's jaw tightened, and for a second, I thought he might say something that would actually make sense. But instead, he stormed out of the room, muttering under his breath about how I'd ruined everything. He slammed the door so hard on his way out that the walls rattled, and Aunt Beth gave me a pointed look. "Well," she said with a shrug, "that was about as mature as I expected him to be." I didn't see Ryan again after that, but from what Aunt Beth later told me, he didn't take the loss quietly. Apparently, he was furious with my dad for not being honest about the will, and for getting him into this mess in the first place. The two of them had a massive argument that ended with Ryan packing up and moving out of Laura's house. "Good riddance," Aunt Beth had said when she told me. "It's about time someone held him accountable for his actions." As for Laura, she wasn't much better. I ran into her at the grocery store a few weeks after the court ruling, and the tension was palpable. She gave me a tight-lipped smile as we passed each other in the cereal aisle, then stopped to say, "I hope you're happy." Her tone was icy, but I didn't rise to it. "I'm not happy," I replied evenly, "but I am proud of myself for standing up for what's right." She didn't respond. She just shook her head and walked away, leaving me standing there feeling a mix of frustration and relief. The truth was, winning the case hadn't magically fixed everything. The house was mine again, but the scars of what had happened ran deep. My relationship with my dad was still in shambles, and I doubted it would ever fully recover. But despite everything, I knew I'd made the right decision. I'd stood up for my mom's legacy, and I hadn't let Ryan or Laura bully me into backing down. That was enough for me, for now, at least. There was still a lot of work to do. The house needed repairs, my heart needed time to heal, and I wasn't sure what the future held for me or my family. But as I stood in the house that day, looking around at the walls that had once felt so full of love and laughter, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. This was where I belonged, and no one was going to take it away from me again. If Ryan's meltdown after the court ruling had been dramatic, my dad's reaction was quieter, but it hit me harder. For weeks after the hearing, He left me voicemail after voicemail, trying to explain himself. Each one was a mix of guilt, excuses, and desperate attempts to patch things up. "I know I made a mistake," he said in one message, his voice heavy with regret. "I thought I was doing the right thing at the time, but I see now how wrong I was. Please, my name, call me back. Let's talk." Another message came a few days later. "You're my daughter," he said, his voice cracking. "I don't want this to come between us forever. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." But no matter how many times I listened to those voicemails, I couldn't bring myself to call him back. Each time, I remembered the look on his face when I confronted him about selling the house, how he brushed it off like it wasn't a big deal. I remembered the months of stress and heartache he'd put me through just to protect Ryan. I wasn't ready to forgive him, not yet. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after the ruling, he showed up unannounced at Aunt Beth's house. I was in the backyard pulling weeds from her garden when I heard his voice. "My name," he called, his voice tentative. I froze, my heart sinking. I hadn't seen him since the court hearing, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face him now. But when I turned around, he was standing by the fence, looking older and more tired than I'd ever seen him. "Can we talk?" he asked, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to send him away. But something in his expression, the guilt, the sadness, made me nod. I gestured to the patio table, and he walked over, sitting down with a heavy sigh. "I know I messed up," he began, his voice quiet. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now how badly I hurt you." I sat across from him, my arms crossed, trying to keep my voice steady. "Dad," I said, "you didn't just hurt me. You betrayed me. You sold the house Mom left us. For what? To bail out Ryan? To impress Laura? What was it all for?" He looked down at his hands, guilt etched across his face. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, in a voice so soft I almost didn't hear him, he said, "I thought I was helping." "Helping who?" I demanded. "Because it sure as hell wasn't me." He sighed again, rubbing his temples like he was trying to find the right words. "Ryan's had a tough life," he said finally. "I thought if I helped him get on his feet, it would bring the family closer together. I thought it would make things better." "It didn't," I said bluntly. "It tore us apart." He nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I know," he said, "and I'm sorry. I wish I could take it all back." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that he was truly sorry, that he understood the depth of what he'd done. But the wound was still too fresh, too raw. "You can't just apologize and expect everything to go back to the way it was," I said, my voice shaking. "Do you even realize how much damage you've done? You didn't just sell the house. You sold Mom's house. You sold her memory. And you didn't even tell me." "I didn't think it would end like this," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now how wrong I was. And I'm sorry. My name? I'm so sorry." For the first time since this whole mess began, I saw tears in his eyes. He looked broken, and a small part of me felt for him. But the larger part of me was still angry, still hurt. "I need time," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can forgive you, but I need time to figure it out." He nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I understand," he said, "but I hope, someday, you'll let me make it up to you. I don't want to lose you. My name." I didn't respond. I didn't know what to say. When he left a few minutes later, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and a flicker of hope that maybe, someday, things could be different. But I wasn't ready to let him back into my life. Not yet. As I sat alone in the backyard after he left, I thought about everything that had happened. I thought about my mom, about the promises she'd made me, and the promises my dad had broken. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: rebuilding trust would take time. And for now, I needed to focus on myself and the house that had finally come back to me. One day, maybe things with my dad could be repaired. But today was not that day. With the house back in my name, I decided it was time to reclaim it, not just legally, but emotionally. Walking through the empty rooms for the first time after the court ruling felt surreal. The space, once so full of warmth and laughter, now felt cold and distant, like a ghost of what it used to be. The living room where my mom and I used to decorate the Christmas tree was now bare, the walls scuffed from Ryan's careless moving. The kitchen, once filled with the smell of her cooking, had broken cabinets and a leaky faucet that hadn't been fixed in months. The neglect was obvious, and it broke my heart to see how much the house had changed. But instead of wallowing in what was lost, I decided to take action. This was still my home, And if I wanted it to feel like that again, I needed to rebuild. Not just the house, but my life within it. The first thing I did was repaint the walls. Aunt Beth helped me pick out colors, insisting that I go for something bright and uplifting. You need colors that reflect your future, not your past, she said, holding up a swatch of pale yellow for the living room. As we painted, we talked about my mom, her love for the house, the little quirks she'd added to make it special. Remember that wallpaper she picked out for the dining room? Aunt Beth said, laughing. She made me help her put it up, and we spent hours arguing over whether the flowers were lined up properly. I laughed, the memory warming my heart. She was so particular about everything. But that's what made it perfect. Slowly but surely, the house started to feel like home again. We replaced the old, mismatched furniture Ryan had left behind with pieces that felt more like me. Cozy armchairs, a new dining table, and curtains in soft blues and greens. Aunt Beth even found a beautiful rug that reminded me of one my mom used to have, and it tied the whole living room together. Fixing the kitchen was another big project. The leaky faucet had been an annoyance for months, but it was nothing compared to the state of the cabinets. Some were falling off their hinges, and others had missing handles. Aunt Beth, being the handywoman she was, rolled up her sleeves and showed me how to fix them. Your mom would have been all over this, she said as we worked. She loved a good DIY project. I could almost hear my mom's voice in the back of my mind, encouraging me to keep going. With every repair, every coat of paint, and every new piece of furniture, the house started to feel less like a reminder of what I'd lost and more like a celebration of what I still had. The garden was the final piece. My mom had always taken pride in her roses, and I was determined to bring them back to life. Aunt Beth and I spent an entire weekend pulling weeds, planting new flowers, and pruning the bushes that had grown wild under Ryan's carelessness. By the end of the weekend, the garden looked vibrant again, a symbol of renewal and hope. It wasn't just the house that was being rebuilt, it was me. For months, I'd been consumed by anger and grief, feeling like I was drowning in everything that had happened. But as I worked on the house, piece by piece, I felt a sense of control returning to my life. I wasn't just fixing broken cabinets or repainting walls. I was fixing myself, reclaiming the parts of me that had been lost in the chaos. One afternoon, as Aunt Beth and I unpacked boxes together in the newly decorated living room, she looked at me with a proud smile. Your mom would be so proud of you, she said. You fought for what she built. Don't ever forget that. Her words stayed with me. This wasn't just a house. It was a legacy. It was a reminder of my mom's love, her determination, and everything she'd stood for. By the time the house was finished, it looked nothing like the neglected shell Ryan had left behind. It was bright, welcoming, and full of personal touches that made it mine. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I felt overwhelmed, moments when the weight of everything threatened to pull me under. But with Aunt Beth's support and my mom's memory as my guide, I pushed through. Standing in the living room one evening, looking around at the home I'd rebuilt, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. This was more than just a house. It was a fresh start. And for the first time in months, I felt ready to move forward. It's been a year since that Christmas Eve when everything fell apart. Sometimes, it feels like a lifetime ago. Other times, the memories are so vivid they feel like they happened yesterday. Either way, I've learned to live with the scars it left behind. My dad and I are on speaking terms now, though things are far from perfect. He's been making an effort, calling more often, stopping by occasionally to check on the house. But there's a distance between us that wasn't there before. Trust is a fragile thing, and once it's broken, it takes time to rebuild. I'm proud of you, he said during one of his recent visits, as we sat in the newly renovated living room. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to be better. For you. For your mom. I nodded, appreciating the gesture, but I didn't say much. Words are easy. Actions take work. For now, I'm content with letting time do its thing. As for Ryan, I haven't heard a single word from him since he stormed out of the house after the court ruling. Aunt Beth told me he moved out of Laura's house not long after that, but where he went or what he's doing now is a mystery, and I'm perfectly fine with that. He doesn't cross my mind much anymore, but when he does, it's with a mix of pity and frustration. I can't imagine living with that level of entitlement and never learning from my mistakes. I hope, for his sake, that he's figured himself out, but if he hasn't, that's not my problem anymore. Laura, too, has stayed out of my life. Occasionally, I'll hear through the grapevine that she's tried to spin the story to make me look like the villain, but I've stopped caring about her opinion. People who know me, really know me, understand what I went through and why I had to fight. That's all that matters. The house, though, that's where the real healing has happened. Over the past year, I've poured my heart and soul into making it a home again. From the fresh coats of paint on the walls to the new garden blooming in the backyard, every inch of this place feels like a testament to resilience. There are little touches of my mom everywhere. The framed photo of her on the mantel, the vase of fresh flowers in the dining room, the wind chimes she used to love that now hang on the front porch. This house is her legacy, but it's also mine. And as I walk through the rooms, feeling the warmth and love that I've worked so hard to restore, I know she'd be proud. Letting go of the anger and hurt hasn't been easy, but it's been necessary. For a long time, I carried the weight of what happened like a heavy backpack I couldn't take off. But slowly, piece by piece, I've been able to set it down. I've realized that holding on to anger only keeps you tied to the people who hurt you. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It means freeing yourself to move forward. Now, when I think back on everything that happened, it doesn't feel like a story of loss. It feels like a story of strength, of standing up for myself, even when it was hard, of honoring my mom's memory by fighting for what she loved, and of discovering just how much I'm capable of when I refuse to give up. Aunt Beth still visits regularly, and every time she comes over, she comments on how much the house has changed. "It looks better than ever," she said last week as we sipped tea on the porch. "Your mom would be over the moon." I smiled, feeling a warmth that has become more familiar over the past year. It's a quiet kind of pride, the kind that comes from knowing you've built something beautiful out of something broken. This house is more than just a building. It's a symbol of everything I've been through and everything I've overcome. Sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones you never see coming. But in the end, they're the ones that teach you what you're truly capable of. And as I sit on the porch, watching the sun set over the garden, I know one thing for sure. I'm exactly where I'm meant to be.